everyone, and welcome to this first lecture in our new series on History and Philosophy of Science in 20 Objects. My name is Greg Raddick. I'm a professor of History and Philosophy of Science here at Leeds, and on behalf of my colleagues, it's our pleasure to be launching ourselves and indeed launching you on what we envisage as a 2-year odyssey into our subjects. The objects that we're going to be lecturing about come from the University of Leeds Museum of the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. The museum itself is only about 10 years old, but the objects that it embraces stretch from the 20th century right on back, as you'll see in just a moment, to a very long time ago indeed. Now, our mission in these lectures is to use these objects to introduce and to illustrate what we regard as major themes in the understanding of science. What kind of a thing science is, how it's changed and how it works when it works, and why an understanding of its past can be so important to understanding not just the present, but even the future. So without further ado, please join me now in welcoming our first lecturer, who is also the director of our museum, Dr. Mike Finn.
Got sound. Thank you, Greg, and thank you all for coming. So, straight away, let's get to the object. It's over here. It's over there because my students said they get nervous when I'm moving around near the objects. So, the object, and I've got to thank at this point Anna Reeves, who is from the School of Languages, Cultures and Societies, who couldn't be here today, but is an expert on ancient Cypriot pottery and brought the object to our attention and help to identify it. So we have then a figurine. It's hand-modelled in clay, and it represents a rider mounted on a horse. It would once have been painted in geometric decorative patterns, but few traces of those remain. The modelling you could describe as crude. I think there's little attempt at realism. The horse's neck is longer than its body. The torso is just a column, and his legs sort of rudimentary shape and merge into the horse. But nevertheless, there is detail there. The horse's harness is complex and well constructed. He's got a helmet and a pinched nose and a jutting beard when you look closely. One of his hands is holding the bridle, the other is raised up. He may once have been holding a weapon, maybe a spear made out of a different material. If he has, that's long gone. And so, similar figurines like this, we know have been found at different sites on the Greek mainland, the Aegean, and in Cyprus. And so we're fairly sure this object originates in that broad area, very likely from Cyprus. So some aspects of the horse's detailed harness indicate Near Eastern influence. So we're talking about the edge of the ancient Greek world this comes from. Now, figurines like this are often excavated in tombs and sanctuaries in Greek and Cyprus. These two appear examples of others that have been uncovered with the original paintings still intact. And ours, like these, would probably have been an offering to the dead or to the gods. It's a representation of a man, a powerful warrior. We know he must have been rich and important because he had a horse, the universal sign of wealth and importance. And these two examples here are even earlier than ours. These are about 200 years older than we think ours is. And interestingly, the one on the left, an example from Oxford, was owned by T.E. Lawrence, so they worked their way into modern ownership. Now, I think you can learn a lot from looking at objects. We're familiar with reading books, papers and manuscripts for information, but I think we can do that with objects too. Objects are made, they're used, they change over time. And we can learn about a particular period or idea by asking, how was it made? Who made it? What do they make it for? What theories or ideas are encapsulated in an object? And this is just as relevant, these questions are just as relevant to ask whether we're talking about a statue from 7th century BCE or about a microscope from the 1980s. And indeed, we will be looking at microscopes from the 1980s in future months. Now, we don't know exactly where this one is from. We're fairly certain it's from Greece. But as we're not sure, it could have been something other than an offering to the gods. It could have been a child's toy. That's unlikely, but it's a possibility. We don't know its exact find spot. We have a strong idea it's in Cyprus. We don't know the history of the place, the geographical area, who excavated it, whose hands it's been in since then. So there's a lot of questions we don't know. So why, we might ask, would we start a series on history and philosophy of science in 20 objects with this object? Because when people think about ancient science, they usually have objects like these in mind. Astrolabes and the Antikythera mechanism. Devices for calculating the heavens, for predicting astronomical movements and seasons on the calendar. Well, we have to start somewhere. And as Greg said, this is the oldest object in our collection, so it kind of makes sense to start here. It's a neat beginning. And we could also say, well, why start here? Well, it was around this time, about the time that this object was made, that Thales of Miletus was alive and working in the same area, in this broad geographical area. And he is regarded by many as the first true philosopher in the Greek tradition, to some even the starting point of scientific thinking. And why is that? That's because he's seemingly the first to use deductive reasoning to explain natural phenomena, appearances and changes in the world around us. He explains and understands them by reference to natural phenomena, not the gods or deities or mysterious happenings. Indeed, for him, everything could be explained from water. Water was the origin of all things on earth. Now, another reason why we might start with around the period of Thales is that, famously, Thales is the astrologer who fell into a well in Aesop's fables. So, if we want to look back to the origins of absent-minded academic scientists, too busy staring at the stars to look where they're going, then we would start here. But even if we did make that compelling case why we should start then, there are still people who would argue, no, this is not the starting point of science. We could look back as far as ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia as where science really began, hundreds, if not thousands of years before this object was created. As a practical pursuit, we might understand science as the acquisition of useful knowledge about the world, which is used to help people plan and exploit their work, their travels, farming and agriculture, animal husbandry. These are science-like activities, and they go much further back than ancient Greece. So why then would we start with a wholesome rider? Well, I think it's a useful object. It helps us understand a lot of things. For a start, the object shows us how, over time, an object can have multiple uses, how its meaning can change over time, over 2,500 years. Something so expressionistic or impressionistic, a piece of art or worship, can end up becoming an object of science, of scientific thinking. And that's because, above all, this is an object depicting a human. Science, whenever we argue it began, and over the course of these lectures we'll be questioning that, whenever it did begin, what it is the study of the natural world, and the manipulation and understanding of that natural world. And we humans have always been the thing within the natural world that we are most interested in. Where do we come from? What makes us who we are? What happens to us when we die? These are questions that we've long been interested in. Now, our ideas about what nature is like, including what humans are like, have often borrowed ideas and borrowed imagery from other areas of life. So we'll see in the course of this lecture that the image of the horse and rider, so inspiring to ancient Mediterranean sculpture makers, has inspired thinkers from ancient times to the near present day in understanding what we call the mind or the soul. And moreover, for all that our own idea in the 21st centuries of science is I'm crackling quite a lot. Okay. Our idea of science is of a forward-looking enterprise, a progressive enterprise. It's important to appreciate that science is just as much a backward-looking enterprise. It's always been full of thoughtful people asking themselves how to relate to, or how you ought to relate to, the past, to people, ideas, and objects that came before. So by following some of the lives of the horse and rider and objects, like today and in future lectures, we'll get a little bit clear on how the past serves as a creative resource for science today. Okay. So, whilst Thales, the clumsy philosopher, might have been given some importance by some people, in our Western tradition, we usually look a couple of centuries later to Plato in Athens in mainland Greece as more clearly laying the foundations for philosophy and science. Plato it was who saw an underlying order in nature, who raised maths as a uniquely significant form of knowledge, and who prized giving clear and precise formulations to one's thinking. In this light, he emphasised things like the importance of the 5 Platonic solids, the 5 polyhedral shapes, the physical structures that could be constructed out of repeated polygon shapes. And these are mathematical shapes, attributed with great significance, and assumed to be the structures that underlie the real world, the physical world. He's not the first person to think of these shapes. He's the first person, or he's the one that really makes them an important way of understanding what the world might be made of at its essence. He had much to say on lots of other things, on the nature of knowledge, of art, of reality. And these are all issues that we're going to come to again and again in the lectures. Moreover, like the maker of this horse and rider, Plato was interested in death, in immortality, in the soul of man, what happens to us. And in his work, the Phaedrus, presented as a dialogue between Phaedrus and Plato's own teacher Socrates, he discussed the soul. So he takes the soul for granted, that it's something separate from our physical bodies, a part of us that is immortal. It's an entity, it's a different thing, but the soul isn't mathematical, it can't be understood the way things in the physical world are. And so he turns instead to the horse and rider. Plato, in fact, looks at a rider with 2 horses. And he says, of the nature of the soul, though her true form be ever a theme of large and more than mortal discourse, let me speak briefly and in a figure, and let the figure be composite. A pair of winged horses and a charioteer. Now the winged horses and the charioteers of the gods are all of them noble and of noble descent, but those of other races are mixed. The human charioteer drives his in a pair, and one of them is noble and of noble breed, and the other is ignoble and of ignoble breed. And the driving of them of necessity gives a great deal of trouble to him. So this is the human soul. It's split into 3 parts. The charioteer is intellect, reason, the part of the soul that's in charge and in control of the whole. One horse I'm not sure which one it is in this picture. The noble one represents rational or moral impulses, the positive part of our passionate natures. The other represents the soul's irrational passions, appetites, desires. And the charioteer has to control both of these at the same time and stop them from going in different directions. So these are the three parts of the soul as Plato sees it. The rational part, the appetites, the positive passions, and the spirited passions. He's not saying that irrational part of our soul is bad, necessarily. It has a place. Madness can be a gift, he says. And love is a form of madness, and that can be a gift too. So, in discussing the soul, Plato was providing what we nowadays might call a psychology, a theory of how the soul, or psyche, or mind as we might call it today, the mental apparatus, works. He's offering us a way to understand our own souls, our own minds, how to introspect, how to think about the ideas, thoughts and feelings we have. Now, according to Plato, each thing that exists on earth, even an object of language, a word, has a corresponding perfect form or perfect idea beyond the material world. And the only way that the soul, the mind, our thinking apparatus can ever gain true knowledge, genuine knowledge, is through recollection of perfect forms, not by thinking about the physical, imperfect world, but these perfect forms of things in the Platonic world. So the mind plays an important role, and he's given us a way of understanding it. His student, Aristotle, took these ideas, took the horse and rider idea too. And Aristotle, again, is an important figure. For a lot of people, he really is the starting point for science. We'll be coming back to why. But he has a slightly different view from his teacher, from Plato. For him, whatever the soul is, it's not some immaterial thing that exists separate from our body. The soul is the perfect form of a living thing. It's the essence of a living thing. So, the soul is whatever makes us alive. It's the organising principle of the perfect example of a living thing. So all living things are made of matter, first. They have their material cause. And this is organised then in some particular way to create a plant, or a dog, or a human. And the way that it's ordered is its formal cause. So the soul of a human would be different from the soul of a horse, for example. We start off with plants. The plant has a soul. It has a capacity for nourishment and reproduction. Lower animals also have that, but they also have the ability to move and direct themselves. And humans have all of these abilities plus reason and intellect, the highest powers, language. So the material cause, the matter that we're made of, and the formal cause, the way this is organised, are the first two causes of all things. The four causes explain the physical world. They explain the changes in appearance of the world around us. Four causes. So these are the first two. The third cause, then, is the efficient or moving cause. This consists of the things that move us in the world, which interact and are the agency for our movement. So the efficient cause of a boy would be his father, according to Aristotle. The efficient cause of the charioteer, or the rider, is the horse. He's only moving as long as the horse is active. And finally, an event's final cause is the end to which it's directed. Its telos, its end point, its reason for being. So for a seed its telos is to become a plant. What the final cause is for humans is up for debate. What are we here for? Don't know. Now, as I said, Aristotle returns to the idea of horses leading a rider, a charioteer, to explain how things are moved in the world. This is the metaphor or the image that he likes to use. Now, we've picked up on Aristotle, but he offers so much for history of science to consider beside his understanding of the horse and rider. From Aristotle, we gain a cosmology, a theory of the universe, which is really influential. So Aristotle describes a world of four elements: earth, water, air, and fire. The four elements you've come across before. And these move and change according to the four causes we've heard of already. And Aristotle's explanation of the world is simple, efficient, it makes sense. And he tells us the earth is at the centre of the universe. Why is it there? Because earth is heavy, its place is to fall towards the ground. That explains also why a pen falls. It explains mechanics, physical phenomena. So Aristotle is a science of elements that make sense. There's also the fifth element, which is the heavens. So on earth, things move in a straight line. In the heavens, they move in a circular pattern. The planets moving around the earth. So a nice simple explanation. We also, from Aristotle, have a cosmology, an explanation of the universe with four humours. Black bile from the spleen, phlegm from the brain, blood from the heart, and yellow bile from the liver. And between these four humours, we understand human diseases, human temperaments and characteristics. So we get from Aristotle a fully coherent cosmology, an understanding of the world. That's dominant in Europe, in Western Europe certainly, for 1.5 millennia. In our part of the world, until the middle of the second millennium, Aristotle's thinking dominates. Ancient knowledge represents the highest learning. A Christianized version. Aristotle wasn't a Christian, but when his work being Christianized, along with religious texts, they represent the source of knowledge that we should all refer to. Now, the dominance of Aristotle, leaving off in the 5th century, 4th century BC, continues into the Renaissance period, round about the 14th to the 17th century. Now, this is the era where man becomes the measure of all things. It's an era driven by a renewed interest in the ancient world. And that's motivated by several things. By the discovery of lost ancient texts. Texts by ancient writers that had been forgotten about or not even known about at all are uncovered, their wisdom forgotten. And people turn again to the ancient world as the highest source of knowledge. So, in this period, people looking back again to the ancient world. And yet, at the same time as they're doing that, at the time that scholars are looking more intensely back to the ancient world, the seeds of modernity were being sown in their work. The seeds for breaking away from the ancient world, challenging received knowledge. This is an era that's come to be known, but again we're going to question that idea, as the scientific revolution. This era of the 15th to 17th century. This is an era where travel to the new worlds brings Western Europe into contact with things that we hadn't seen before. Plants, animals that were never known about. With new technologies like the microscope or telescope, looking at ever smaller things or ever larger things that uncover aspects of the world that the ancients didn't know about. That the ancients can't have been perfect because they didn't know these things. And we're uncovering details in that period that the ancients either didn't know or got wrong. So we're talking about the period here of Vesalius, the great physician, challenging ideas from ancient medicine that had stood for over 1,000 years, where people like Francis Bacon and René Descartes challenged Aristotle's ideas of knowledge, of the way the world should be studied. And figures like Copernicus, Galileo, Newton reimagine the entire universe. They situate not the Earth at the centre, but the sun. And they see the heavens are imperfect, not in the way that Aristotle understood them. And mathematics can be used to explain what's going on. So this is an important period in the development of science, and that's really somewhere I'll be picking up in future lectures. So, in this era, people are turning against ancient knowledge, or at least rejecting received wisdom. And yet, from that period, from the 17th century right up until the early 20th century, the ancient world and the ancients themselves still remain heroes for lots of people in Western Europe. There's still much interest in the ancient world. The classics, ancient texts are still taught. It's still the starting point for all study. Every important question that could be asked was asked in the ancient world. So why wouldn't we go back and start with their answers too? And this is especially true in the 19th century. So, in this period, the ancient world is really debated, especially by the Victorians in the 19th century in Britain. They're obsessed with the ancient world. They question sort of the teaching syllabus at universities. Young Turks say, why are we still teaching scientists Plato and Aristotle? What use is this? But at the same time, there are some changes, but it doesn't disappear because the ancient world is so important to the Victorians. They're obsessed with empire, not just the British, but other empires are being built around Europe. And if you look back to the ancient Greek or Roman empires, you can learn lessons about how to run an empire, how to rule large numbers of people. So that's why, or what's part of the reason why the Greek and Roman poets, Homer, Virgil, Horace, are still taught widely. And why the philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome, especially Plato, continues to be taught widely to students. So, the modern era still looks back to the ancient world constantly. Not only that, the ideas from there, but the objects. So in the 18th and 19th century, collecting becomes important. Classical pieces, precisely like the Horse and Rider, start to fill museums. It's in the period from the 18th to the early 20th century when architecture is often neoclassical too. So the interest in the ancient world is clear. And this is the era of the great museums being built. The 19th century in Britain, at least, things like the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Natural History Museum in London, crop up. They're often filled with these ancient objects. Museums, we can trace back to the Renaissance, to that period that we call the Scientific Revolution, as collections of individuals, of wealthy private individuals who had enough money and time to build up collections. But in the 19th century, museums really become a public source. They're for the benefit of the nation. An example of the way this transition happened is the British Museum collection and a lot of the British Library as well started off as the private collection of Hans Sloane, a private collector, member of the Royal Society. Now, in the 19th century, this is the era of growing education. And museums are a place where you teach the masses. You bring them into contact with high culture and learning, and hopefully they'll, just by osmosis, pick some of that up and become better citizens. Museums are also a statement of power and wealth. Look at us. We have an empire. We can collect these trophies from around the world, and we are seeing nowadays the effects of especially the British Empire taking things from around the world. So as the empire grows, the trophies it collects grows. And museums are a celebration of the state. They show its place in history. They also show the success of industry and commerce, of engineering and arts, and of the sciences, of the nation, of the British nation to the rest of the world. So museums become a place where science is celebrated and taught. And indeed, the 19th century, such an important period, is when science, as we really understand it today, comes into being. The labs, university teaching, university courses, students, research projects and specific techniques and technologies, making arguments for funding, separating sciences into discrete disciplines, from pathology to physiology, geography to geology, anatomy to astronomy. It's in the 19th century when these disciplines we know today really come into being as separate things. And now, one of the 19th century new sciences that really sort of takes on its scientific status in the 19th century is archaeology. So the study of past civilizations and societies through the objects, the artifacts left behind. We don't know, but it's very likely this object made its way to Britain in the 19th century. So the 19th century was the era of sciences. It was the era of mind and brain too. This is really the period when psychology, psychiatry, neurology, the sciences trying to understand the mind or the soul, as it used to be known, and its relation to the body really come into being. Now, we'll hear more about some of those sciences in future weeks, but undoubtedly the most famous figure in this period, studying the mind and brain, is Sigmund Freud. So Freud, the Viennese doctor at the end of the century who really revolutionised the way we consider our own minds, the way they govern our lives, in ways that we can't control. So, Freud is an important figure. He rejected a lot of scientific ideas of the time. He rejected what other doctors were doing, trying to use medical remedies to treat mental problems. And instead, he says we have to focus on the life of the individual and create a new technique, a new vocabulary for understanding and studying the mind. So things that we may be familiar with, the interpretation of dreams, the use of free association, the study of, and this is the point where I get self-conscious, Freudian slips, all of these things that reveal the hidden inner life of an individual, the hidden unconscious. And Freud likens his new methods of psychoanalysis to archaeology. So he says, look, you dig down, the analyst. He uncovers buried, hidden things in the mind, in different places and at different depths, which explain or reveal past events in the life of the individual. And you have to go slowly with care, or you'll damage things. So Freud is likening study of the mind to archaeology, to looking for ancient objects. And he's obsessed by the ancient world. And the thought that the psyche, or the mind, or the soul, or whatever we're going to call it still, is the product of thousands of years of civilization. Indeed, to Freud, civilization is both a description of the world, but also a process that we all have to go through. We all become civilized. So Freud, this great figure of modernity, supposedly, this great modern figure, was obsessed with the ancient world. And he collected a lot. He collected objects and he collected a horse and rider, and this is his own version. This is Boeotian from the Greek mainland, hence slightly different from ours, but you see this type of pattern that would have been on it originally. He has this sitting on his desk in Vienna, and he uses it to describe the mind. So Freud says, thinking back to Plato, another figure he's very keen on and reads a lot, and he rekindles that tripartite idea of the soul that Plato had suggested. Freud also thinks love is a form of madness. So he says, yeah, Plato was right. There are irrational passions, desires that we're born with, that affect us, that we just have to deal with. And that's what he calls the id. Now, these have to be controlled to match the superego, which is the conscious moral part of us, which is shaped by the world and environment around us. It's the civilized part. And sitting between the outward-facing part of our psyche and the inner desires is the ego, which has to reconcile our internal desires with external reality. And to understand that, he turns to the horse and rider, and he says, one might compare the relations of the ego to the id with that between a rider and his horse. The horse provides the locomotive energy, and the rider has the prerogative of determining the goal and of guiding the movements of his powerful mouth towards it. But all too often, in the relations between the ego and the id, we find a picture of the less ideal situation, in which the rider is obliged to guide his horse in the direction in which it itself wants to go. So sometimes we lose that control, and our internal desires are what drive us. Now, Freudian psychoanalysis, Freudian thinking is enormous, massively influential in the modern world. He makes humans the centre again. He reimagines how we should understand ourselves, how we are the products of our life patterns, of childhood, of things that happen to us that we're not even aware of. And he still has a legacy today. And I think, although we might question, or some people might question whether we should count Freud as part of the scientific story, I think he is. Undoubtedly, he was driven by the scientific developments of the 19th century. He was driven by a desire to make understanding the mind a scientific practice. So we have Freud, a scientific figure, although I know when the Science Museum a few years ago opened an exhibition on Freud, there was a big furore by lots of people saying that's not science, so hopefully you don't agree with that. So we've come to the early 20th century, and the horse and rider is once again gained a sort of meaning for understanding the soul or the mind. Now, I said at the beginning, we can learn a lot from an object. We can learn where it was found, for example, with this one. And if we knew more about it, we could say who's owned it, what's it being used for, when has it changed hands within its history. Unfortunately, for us, most of that information is lost. But we can still use the object to think about history and philosophy of science. Now, we've looked at the object. One of the other first things we might see when we look at this object is that it's actually mounted on a plinth You might see them, we'll bring it outside for people to look at more closely afterwards, and held down with sort of thin plastic wires. And it came in this sort of rather dashing 1970s green box with a carry case, with its own handle. Now, this object in the 1970s found its way into the Educational Resource Service of West Yorkshire, and it was part of a collection that was lent to schools to help teach students. There are lots of these around, but not many of the objects are originals. A lot of them are replicas in the boxes. All we know is that in the 1970s, this object was bought for £14, and that's it. Now, the idea of taking objects like this into classrooms, it's starting to get more popular again in recent years, but it's really fallen out of fashion over the last 30, 40 years. The idea of using objects to teach students at all. And I think that's largely because of new technologies. We don't need objects, or we think we don't need objects anymore. We can teach medics with digital displays rather than with specimens in jars. We can teach physicists using computer models rather than wires and circuits and electrical components. So technology, the theories and underlying objects are kind of black box, they're hidden. We just see the output, we don't see what's going on behind it. But I think if we look closely, we see, and we can learn so much from an object, how this one ended up from ancient Cyprus in classroom in Pontypridd. So, there we have then a study of an object, a horse and rider, from its origins to the 20th century. And I think it shows us a few key things to recap. So, I think I want to say that on lessons to learn, or things that will be picked up again in future lectures, are firstly that science, technology, medicine, the thinking and doing of these things are both local and global. They're both very particular to the world in which they come from and happen, but also move around and change as they do, and are part of international thinking. So this object from the ancient world, from the other side of Europe, ended up in West Yorkshire for a very different purpose. But in the meantime, it had other uses too, other understandings. I think I also want to say we can see how objects, and in particular this horse and rider figurine, has inspired thinkers from the ancient world to the modern one in understanding what we call the mind or the soul. So objects can have different meanings, or can inspire different scientific ideas. And I think, again, we can see that science is a backward-looking enterprise. Scientists, certainly in the 19th and 20th century, but in earlier periods too, looked back to the ancient world to gain ideas, to gain sort of theories. They're not always sort of thinking forwards, not always about progress. Now, in the coming months, we'll be continuing the story of the scientific revolution. In the next lecture, with Dr. John Hodge, we'll be looking at a two-headed fish and thinking about monsters and what they tell us about laws of nature and the natural world. After that, we'll be looking at tuning forks and what they tell us about music and hearing. Then we'll be looking at microscopes, or our microscope in particular, and what that tells us about observation, scientific observation. And then in lecture 5, we'll be looking at an air pump, perhaps the object of the scientific revolution and what it tells us about experiment. HPS will return and fish with two heads. So all that remains at this point is to thank you for listening and to see if anyone has any questions.
Shortly, inviting you to unbridle your ids and join us